Namaste. Now that we know what biodiversity is, what its importance is, and how do we put a rupee or a dollar value to it, let us now have a look at the threats to biodiversity. Now, before beginning, let us ask the question, is our biodiversity actually under threat? Or, in other words, are we losing any number of species? If so, can we put a numerical value to the number of species that we are losing every year? So, let us begin with a simple calculation. So, consider an island. So, this is an island and this island has an area of A, and we want to know the number of species that are there in this island. So, the species number is question mark. So, we can intuitively think that if the island is of this size versus if we had a larger sized island, would we have more number of species in the smaller island or would we have more number of species in the larger island? Now, it turns out that in the case of a smaller island, we will have lesser number of ecosystems, we will have lesser number of habitats and so lesser number of species, whereas in the case of a larger island, maybe we would be having some patches of woodland, some patches of grasslands, some patches of water, maybe some patches of sand and so on. So, intuitively we can say that if the area of an island is larger, we would be having more number of species there. So, we represent that by saying that the number of species is proportional to the area of the island raised to some constant, because right now we do not know whether it is directly proportional to the area of the island or say area of the island squared or maybe the under root of the area of the island. So, we just put this variable of z. So, z is something that would need to be computed, and here we can also say that s is equal to c into a to the power z. So, we change this proportionality constant with c. So, s is equal to c into a to the power of z, and this is what was first derived by these two people, MacArthur and Wilson, in 1967 when they gave us the island biogeography model. So, in this model, the species richness S of an island is given by S is equal to C into a to the power of z, where A is the size of the island and C and Z are constants depending on the set of species and the island. It has been figured out from a study of a number of islands that the value of Z varies between 0.15 and 0.35. So, let us take a middle value, let us say that the value of Z is 0.3. So, for this value, if the area of the island is A1, we can write that S1 is equal to C into A1 to the power of 0.30, because Z is 0.30. So, S is equal to C into a to the power of Z, here A is A1 and Z is 0.3. Now, let us reduce the area of this island by as much as 90%. So, the area of the island has been reduced and only 10% of the area is left. So, we can write it as A2 is equal to 0.1 into A1, only 10% of the area is left, and so we can say that S2, again using the same formula, it will be S is equal to C into the a to the power of Z. Here A is equal to A2 or 0.1 into A1 and Z is 0.30. So, now let us have a look at the number of species that we would have lost. So, we take a ratio between both of these. So, S2 divided by S1 is given by C1 into C into 0.1 into A1 whole to the power 0.3, which is S2, and S1 is C into A1 to the power 0.30. So, C and C cancel out, A1 to the power of 0.3 also cancels out. So, we have S2 divided by S1 is 0.1 to the power of 0.3, and when we compute that, we get this value of 0.5012, which is close to 50%. Thus, S2 is half of that of S1. So, by this simple calculation, we have found out that by reducing the area by as much as 90%, the species richness has only become halved. So, for instance, coming back to the drawing board, if earlier we had this large area and then all of this area is gone, only this much area is remaining. So, the number of species that are present in even in this small area will be as much as 50% of the number of species that were present in the larger area. So, now this was one simple computation, but then how does this apply to the case of wildlife conservation? So, if we consider our forests, so or let us say if we consider a large patch of land, and this patch of land has say a forest here, a forest here, a slightly larger sized forest here, and maybe a forest here, and rest of the area is covered by anthropogenic influences. So, we may have some habitations, we may have some farmlands, we may have some pasture lands, some industries, and so on. So, even in this block of land, what we can see right now is that we have these smaller pieces, fragments of forest that are separated from each other, and they are surrounded by a whole ocean of human influences. Or essentially what we are observing here are these small islands of forest that are left out in this whole vast area of human influences that has a very little amount of species biodiversity. Because in the case of human habitations, we have converted all our forests into say farmlands. In the farmlands, we are only growing a few species of crops, and we are thwarting off any other species of animal that gets inside. So, essentially if there is any wildlife that tries to get into our farmlands, we push it back. If there are any birds that come into our area, we either shoo them away or we kill them. So, the whole of this anthropogenic landscape has a very little species biodiversity, and these small patches of forest that are remaining are the only patches that now have biodiversity. So, they have become islands in an anthropogenic landscape. So, we can now use the same formula, we can use computations such as these to compute the rate at which we are losing our species. If for instance, this patch of forest was then even more encroached. So, this portion, if it were to be converted into another anthropogenic influence, say a farmland, how many species would remain? So, how do we compute that? Now, let us take the case of our tropical forests. Now, the tropical forests are decreasing at the rate of 1.8% every year. So, for instance, if in 1 year we have an area of A, in the next year we will be having an area A2, which will be given by 100 minus 1.8% of A, which is 98.2% of A, which we can also write it as 0.982 A, or let us say A1. So, A2 is equal to 0.982 into A1. Now, we had seen before that the value of Z varies from 0.15 to 0.35, and we take the lowest value of Z because we are taking the most conservative estimate that is possible. So, now let us compute the number of species. Now, S is equal to C into A to the power Z. So, we have S1 is C into A to the power into A1 to the power of Z, which is C into A1 to the power of 0.15. S2, so this is in the year 1 and this is in year 2, and here we have C into A2 to the power Z is C into A2 is given by 0.982 A1 to the power of 0.15. Now, let us find out S2 by S1, that will be given by C into 0.982 A1 to the power of 0.15 divided by C into A1 to the power of 0.15. C and C cancel out, A1 to the power of 0.15 cancels out, is 0.982 to the power of 0.15, which is given as 0.9973. Now, what does this mean? It means that if we consider just 1 year. So, from in this year we have reduced our population from 100% to 99.73%. So, there is a loss of species that is given by 100 minus 99.73 is 0.27%. So, just by reducing our area by 1.8% every year, we are reducing our number of species by 0.27% every year. Now, this 0.27 might look as a very small figure. Now, coming back to the slides, if we see the estimate of the number of species in tropical forests, we see that the number of species is close to around 10 million. Now, if we take 0.27% of 10 million, we get 27,000 species that we are losing out per year. So, when we looked at in our first lecture, we saw that there are a number of species that have not yet been evaluated. And when we talk about the species in the tropical forest, most of the species come under that category, because there are a number of frogs, there are a number of lizards, there are a number of annelids, a number of insects that are found in the tropical forest. We have not even catalogued those species, but we are losing them out at the rate of 27,000 species per year. Now, why is this computation important? This is important because if you ask any person about extinction, people would give you the example of, say, the dodo, and then people would say that dodo is a bird that got extinct in the 1600s, and then if you talk about other species that got extinct, so people might come up with, say, a few names, say, such as the Yangtze dolphin, but those species can just be counted on the fingertips, because most of the species that we are losing out, we do not even know what those species are. And this very conservative estimate, because we took the lowest value of z that was possible, and we came up with this computation that just in our tropical forests we are losing out species at the rate of 27,000 species per year. Now, there are also other sorts of forests. We have temperate forests, we have grasslands that are also being diverted. So, we can say that we are losing many more number of species than this figure of 27,000 species per year, and so our biodiversity is actually at a very great amount of threat, whether we know it or whether we do not know it. Now, the next question arises, given that we are losing these 27,000 species, are all the species that are found in the tropical forest at an equal risk or they are at different risk? So, are all the species equally susceptible to extinction? And the answer is no. The susceptibility depends on the rarity of the species. The rarer the species, the more is its chance of getting extinct. Because suppose there is a species that has, say, 10 million individuals, and even if we remove 9 million individuals, we will still be left with a million individuals that would be able to propagate the species. But then if we have, say, 10 individuals, and if we remove 9 individuals, we will be left with only 1 individual, and this individual will not be able to breed because it does not have a mate, and so it will be doomed to extinction. The species will be doomed to extinction. So, the susceptibility depends on the rarity of the species. How many individuals are there at present, that would determine whether a species is susceptible to extinction or not. Now, if we know that susceptibility depends on the rarity of the species, the next question would come up, then why are some species rare and why are some species abundant? So, why are some species rarer? So, there are 3 reasons. One is that this species is restricted to an uncommon habitat. So, this habitat is not found anywhere. So, an example is a desert spring. Now, deserts are areas that have very little amount of water, and these springs are found very haphazardly and in very less numbers. Now, if there is a species that requires a desert spring as its habitat, then just because these desert springs are not common, so the species will also not be common. The second reason is a limited geographical range. So, examples include those species that are found in a single lake. So, for instance, in the case of aquatic species, suppose there was a large size lake, and because this lake had a large size, so it had a number of species. Now through diversion of water, we are taking water out, and then this lake is now left only to this much area. Now any of the species that were found in the earlier lake are now bound to live in the smaller area. So a number of species will go extinct. But even more important is that because these species are found in water, they will not be able to shift to say another lake that is there in the vicinity, because these species cannot move over land or they cannot fly. So they will not be able to move to another lake, which limits the geographical range of those species. So these species, as are found in a single lake, they will be extremely rare, and we also call these species as endemic species, which are only found in certain areas, which are not found anywhere else. And the third reason is those species that have low population densities, especially because they are larger animals that require more space. So for example, a species such as the elephants require a huge amount of space. So if suppose we have a total area of A and a species requires an area of A1 per individual, so the number of individuals would be given by A divided by A1. So as A1 increases, the number of individuals decreases. So this is the third reason why some species are rarer, because they are large animals, require more space, so they are already present in a very low population densities. So these are the three reasons why a species is rare. And then what drives these species towards extinction? So there are these 5 factors that we can remember by the acronym of HIPPO, and HIPPO stands for H is habitat loss, I is invasive species. Now invasive species are those species that have come up into a habitat and are displacing all the other species that were native to that area. So for instance, in a lake, there are suppose 100 species of fish. Now for farming purposes, suppose we introduced one more species, say the tilapia species. Now tilapia is a species of catfish. Now catfish is a species that can eat all of the other varieties of fishes that are found in this lake. So it would start by eating some species in the lake, then because it is getting enough amount of nutrition, it would reproduce. Once it has reproduced, now we have more number of tilapia. Now more number of tilapia means that they are eating more number of fishes, and then after a while it would turn out that this lake that earlier had 100 species of fish now is left with say only 10 species of fishes, or maybe at a later point of time we have this lake in which only tilapia is found, nothing else is found. So tilapia in this case would be referred to as an invasive species. It has invaded into this lake and it has displaced or it has exterminated all the other species that are found in that area. So the I in HIPPO stands for the invasive species. P is pollution, which leads to a degradation of the habitat. The other P stands for human overpopulation, because these days human beings are the largest causes of species extinction. So the more number of humans are there, the faster would be the rate of extinction. And O stands for over harvesting. Now over harvesting in this case means that if in a lake 100 fishes, now we are not talking about 100 species of fishes, we are talking about 100 number of fishes. Now all of these fishes go through their natural cycle, so they are also reproducing. Now suppose these 100 fishes give rise to say a 1000 offsprings. Now these offsprings will then be eaten away by a number of other predators, and suppose only say 110 offsprings are left for the next generation. Now in this case, this lake which will slowly start increasing the population of the fishes, but then we can keep it at a constant pace by taking out these 10 individuals. So if we harvested 10 individuals, so minus 10 fishes, then the population would be 100 fishes for the next generation, and then this would be a sustainable harvest. But then in place of removing 10 individuals, suppose we removed 50 individuals. So in the first generation we had 100 individuals, in the second generation we were left with 110 individuals, of which we removed 50 individuals. So how many individuals are left? 110 minus 50, which is 60 individuals in the second generation. So in the first generation we had 100 fishes, in the second generation we have 60 fishes. Now these 60 fishes will not be able to give rise to that number of offsprings. So the number of offspring for the next generation will also reduce. And then because we are harvesting at a rate that is faster than this system can produce, so we will call it an over harvest. So over harvesting is also another factor that is driving species towards extinction, and especially in the case of those species that do not give rise to a number of offsprings, such as the whales. Now for any population of a species to become extinct, there are two kinds of factors that are operating at all times, and these are two factors that lead a population to become extinct. The first factor is the deterministic factors, which act at larger population sizes, and the second are chance factors or stochastic factors, which are more important when the population sizes are smaller. So let us look at these two factors. The first is the deterministic factors that act at large population sizes. What is the birth rate of the population, what is the death rate of the population, and what is the population structure of the population. So for instance, when the birth rate is greater than the death rate, then the population is going to survive, but in case where the death rate is greater than birth rate, so every year this population has 10 new individuals that come in through birth, but 15 individuals die off because of old age. So the population is slowly going towards a decline. So this is a deterministic factor, because this factor will act even at larger population sizes. So even if we have say 1000 individuals, and in these 1000 individuals there is a birth of 100 individuals and 150 individuals are dying off. So even at this large population size, these factors will act. And another factor is the population structure, whether we have more number of adults in the population or whether we have more number of old and young individuals. Because if there is a population that has more number of adults, then they would give rise to more number of offsprings, but if there is a population that has more number of old individuals, then because the old individuals will not give rise to offspring, so the population will go on declining. So these are the deterministic factors. The next are chance factors or stochastic factors, which are more important when the population sizes are smaller. Now these include demographic stochasticity, such as the occurrence of probabilistic events such as reproduction, litter size, sex determination and death. Now coming back to the larger population size, if there are 100 individuals that are born in a population, then we can say that at a sex ratio of 1 male is to 1 female, roughly 50 individuals will be males and roughly 50 individuals will be females. But then look at a smaller population size. Suppose we have a birth of only, so suppose we are left with only 10 individuals, and these 10 individuals give birth to 4 offsprings. Now just by chance it is possible that all of these 4 offsprings are males, there is no female born in this generation. Then what we will observe, that when the females of the earlier generation die out, this new generation does not have any new females to replace the older female. So this becomes a demographic stochasticity because of sex determination. Now such a scenario will not occur at larger population sizes, because suppose we have 1000 individuals and then we have 400 offsprings, then it is very unlikely that all 400 of these will be males, because at a 50% sex ratio we will be having roughly around 200 males and 200 females. But at smaller population sizes, when we have only 4 of these, it is possible just by chance that all 4 of these turn out to be males. Similarly, we have litter size. So in case of a population that can give a litter of 1 offspring to say 10 offsprings, it is possible that just by chance it turns out that in one generation all the litters were of a small size. So that would lead to very fast rate of population decline. Also things such as environmental variations and fluctuations. So for instance, in the case of reptiles such as turtles or crocodiles, so they have a temperature dependent sex determination. So, for instance, in the case of the crocodiles, we have males that are of a larger size, and at larger temperatures we would see more number of males that are formed in that population. Now, in those populations, it turns out that if we have any environmental variation and fluctuation, such as we had a year that had a larger temperature overall, so we will find more number of males that were formed and hardly any number of females. So, that would also lead to an extinction, especially at smaller population sizes. Then catastrophes such as forest fires and diseases that remove a number of individuals from the population. Also things such as genetic processes, including loss of heterogeneity and inbreeding depression. Now, we will look at these in more details in the conservation genetics module, but then essentially what this is saying is that when you have a very small population size, then all the individuals that are there in the population are related to each other. So, they may be, say, grandparents, parents, this generation with brothers and sisters, and then when you do not have any other mate that is remaining in that population, because it is already a very small population, then there would be mating between very close relatives that leads to a number of recessive disorders that come up. Next is deterministic processes such as density dependent mortality on exceeding the carrying capacity of the habitat. So, basically what this is saying is that if you have a larger sized habitat and this habitat can support say 1000 individuals, now this smaller population is confined to a very small habitat that can support say only 10 individuals. Now, in this habitat we had say 10 individuals, and because of population change this rose to 15 individuals. So, in the case of these 15 individuals, the habitat will not be able to support them and there will be a density dependent mortality. So, as soon as this population density increases, these individuals will start dying off. And the next thing is migration among populations. So, it could also be a situation in which most of the individuals migrate out of this population, because of which the population declines. Now, the sensitivity of a species to human impacts. Now, because humans are the major reason of population extinctions, so we also have to have a look at the impact of humans. So, the sensitivity of a species to human impacts is dependent upon a number of factors. One is the adaptability and resilience of the species. So, essentially if there is any human intervention in an area, is the species able to adapt itself, is it resilient to changes, or is it a species that has a very specific habitat requirement, so that if there is any small change in that habitat, the individuals start dying off. So, essentially we are talking about the level of tolerance that a species has. So, for instance, if we have a species that can tolerate temperatures of say 20 degrees to 22 degrees Celsius, and there is another species that tolerates a temperature of say 15 degrees Celsius to say 40 degrees Celsius. Now, both of these species are living in a mountain area in which we are having this small zone, this small band that has a temperature of say 21 degrees Celsius. Now, because of human impacts, because of global warming, the temperature rises from 21 degrees to say 25 degrees. So, this is species 1 and this is species 2. Now, in this case it would happen that species 1 that has a very narrow range of tolerance to temperature would die off as soon as the temperature has increased to 25 degrees Celsius because of the human impacts, whereas the our second species will be more adaptable and will be able to resist these changes. Next, we have human attention. So, charismatic species, most of our flagship species are charismatic species such as tigers or such as polar bears or animals such as say dolphins, and because they capture human attention, so they also become more sensitive because humans have a high demand for their skin, bones and other parts. So, a short while back we had a situation in which there was a very famous lion by the name of Cecil the lion in Africa, and that lion was posed away for its trophy. So, species such as lions, because they take human attention, because they garner human attention, so they become more sensitive to the impacts of human beings. Next is the ecological overlap between humans and the species. The greater the overlap, the higher the impact. Now, here we are talking about the ecological overlap. So, let us consider some species that are found say in the polar regions. Now, because there are very less number of human beings that live in the polar regions, there is very little amount of ecological overlap. So, those species for instance would be safer from the impacts of human beings as compared to species that lived in say plain areas of India. So, for instance, if we consider our Indo-Gangetic floodplains that cover the northern areas of our country, so we have observed quite a huge amount of ecological overlap, because earlier those areas were forested, but then human beings also wanted to live in those areas, human beings also wanted to cultivate those areas. So, all those forests were cut down and all the species that were living in those areas suffered a massive decline in their populations. Now, compared to that, a species that lives in say the very high peaks of Kanchenjunga would be much safer, because there are very less number of human beings that are going there and causing an impact there. So, if there is more ecological overlap, then the impact of human beings is greater. Another point is the home range requirements of the species. So, species that require larger home ranges are more sensitive to human impacts, primarily because they require a larger area. So, in this forest, if there is a species that requires the whole of this forest, and if there is some other species that only requires this much patch of the forest, now if half of this forest is converted into grasslands, the first species that required the whole of the area would suffer much greater than the second species that was living in a very small area, because this small patch is still left out. Now, these are our theoretical considerations, but then we can also quantify the impacts of humans and the impacts of other extinction factors by ways of an analysis that goes by the name of population viability analysis. Now, population viability analysis is the ability, population viability is the ability of a population to persist or to avoid extinction, and population viability analysis is an analysis of the viability of a population. So, essentially in this technique that we are going to discuss in more detail in the conservation genetics module. So, in this technique we will just touch over it here. So, this technique tries to find out whether a population is going to persist or whether it will become extinct for in the next n years. So, for instance, we can compute that in the next 100 years will this population survive or will this population become extinct. The second definition is that population viability analysis is a process by which the extinction probability of a single species population is assessed by integrating data on the life history, demography and genetics of the species with information on the variability of the environment, diseases, stochasticity, etc., by utilizing mathematical models and computer simulations in order to predict whether the population will remain viable or go extinct in a decided time frame under various management options. So, what it is saying is that let us consider a graph of the time period in years. So, this goes from year 0 to say 100 years, and suppose we started with a population of say 20 individuals. So, on the y axis we have the number of individuals. Now, if we have 20 individuals and out of these 20 individuals, suppose we have 12 females and we have 8 males. Now, if we know the life history of the organism, so we are using the life history, demography and genetics of the species. So, what we are asking is that if we have these many individuals and these females, suppose we find out that from in the young females, out of these are say 2, and then the adult females are say 8, and then the old females are say 2. So, in this case, out of these 12 females, 8 females are adults, so they are in the reproductive period, and out of these 8 males, let us say that we have say 3 young males, 2 adults male and 3 old males. Now, if we have such a population structure and we know the demography of this population. So, when we say demography, we are putting in data regarding the litter size. So, whenever there is any breeding, then how many new cubs are formed in the next generation. Also, we want to ask the question, what is the percentage of reproductive age females that breed. Now, such kind of information can be had from the field data, from field observations. So, for instance, we are looking at a tiger population and we are observing that out of say if we have 50 reproductive females and only 30 of them are breeding at any point of time. So, we would say that 30 out of 50 or 60% is the percentage of reproductive age females that would breed. Now, if we put all of these information into our computer simulation and then we also put in the stochasticity variables such as variability of the environment, diseases, stochasticity and so on. So, for instance, we can put into our model that say there are two individuals that are poached every 10 years, or say every third year we have a forest fire that can impact say 2 individuals in the population or say 2% of the individuals of the population. Now, when we put all of these data together in a simulation, what would come out is that because in the case of stochastic phenomena, they can occur in this year or they cannot occur in this year, or maybe 2 of the events can occur together. We can have a forest fire, we can also have a disease in the same year. So, our computer is going to use all of these information to create a number of scenarios. Now, it is possible that in one scenario this population would start increasing and then it would maintain itself here. But then it is also possible that in another scenario we had these stochastic factors that occurred in the beginning. So, we had a disease, we had a forest fire and we also had poaching in the first year. We have reduced these populations. So, in that case it is possible that this population came down here and then after a short while it became extinct. So, the population size went from 20 to 0, whereas in this case the population size went from 20 to 50. Now, these are just 2 scenarios. What our computer is going to do is that it will use n number of situations and n number of simulations to compute that out of every say 100 populations, if we are considering, how many of those populations will become extinct in the next 100 years. So, from that we will get a probability of extinction of a population of starting size 20 with these characteristics of the breeding population. Then we can also simulate the impacts of any management inputs. So, for instance, if we have better protection, so that in place of 2 individuals that are poached every 10 years, we have only 1 individual that is poached every 20 years. So, then we can again simulate the whole thing. So, all of these simulations would give us an indication of the extinction probability of a single species population. So, this goes by the name of population viability analysis, and we are going to look at it in much greater detail in our 6th module, conservation genetics. So, in today's module we had a look at different threats to biodiversity, we had an estimation of the number of species that we are losing out, we had a look at various factors that lead a population towards extinction, such as the factors of hippo, the habitat loss, invasive species, human overpopulation, pollution and the overharvesting of species. We also had a look at why some species become much more susceptible to extinction, because they are rarer or because human beings have a greater attention to them and so on. So, that is all for today, and this is the end of today's module, and from tomorrow we will begin a new module which goes by the name of monitoring of wild animals. So, thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.